Upon learning that his stepmother had poisoned the girls, their grandfather froze, yet he didn't lose his composure, and the entire medical staff reacted swiftly. But how could this happen? George's world came crashing down in an instant. He clutched his chest, feeling a sharp pain, not from his heart, but from his soul. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. His granddaughters, the last rays of light in his life since the death of his son, were gone. How could this have happened? He asked, barely holding back tears. They were found unconscious in their room while undergoing procedures, the nurse explained in a soft but piercing voice. The doctors did everything they could, but they couldn't save them. The phone slipped from his hand, dangling from its cord like a pendulum. He felt weak in the knees and had to steady himself against the edge of the table to keep from falling. The images of his granddaughters running through the garden, their laughter filling the house, flashed before his eyes. Suddenly, a thought struck him like lightning out of the blue. Patricia. His breathing became erratic. No, this can't be a coincidence, he muttered as he put on his coat. Without grabbing his wallet, he walked out of the house, his gaze fixed ahead as though the world around him had ceased to exist. When he arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere seemed colder than usual. The white lights in the hallways reflected off the pale walls, and his footsteps echoed emptily. George approached the reception desk with determined resolve. I want to see my granddaughters, Olivia and Amelia. I need to see them, he declared. I'm sorry, but they're in the morgue, the receptionist replied sympathetically. That's impossible. I need to see them right now. George shouted, feeling a surge of anger. A nurse noticed his outburst and approached with calm understanding. Sir, please calm down. I'll take you to the morgue, but please try to keep your emotions in check, she said. Their footsteps echoed like a solemn march. The nurse carefully opened the morgue door, and the cold air hit his face. Before him lay two bodies covered with white sheets. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and metal. Here they are, the nurse said, lowering her gaze. George approached slowly. With trembling hands, he pulled the sheet from Olivia's face. Her expression was peaceful, as though she were simply sleeping. The sight shattered his heart. He did the same with Amelia, revealing her still face, her expression filled with an impossible silence. My girls, he whispered, gently stroking their cold cheeks. Tears flowed freely from his eyes, his body trembling, but not from the cold, rather, from fury. He couldn't accept this reality. Closing his eyes, he tried to find strength in his memories, but the thought wouldn't leave him. Patricia. These aren't accidents, he said, opening his eyes, filled with determination. The nurse gently placed her hand on his shoulder. I'm so sorry for your loss, she said. No, these aren't accidents, he repeated, his voice firm, like an order. I need to see the security footage. That's prohibited, but I'll speak with the head of security, the nurse replied with uncertainty. Please, do it, he insisted, glancing at his granddaughters once more. The nurse left the morgue. The minutes that followed stretched on endlessly. George couldn't tear his eyes away from his granddaughters, his face a mix of grief and fury. He whispered to himself, I won't let this go unpunished. The morgue door opened. The head of security entered, a stern man with a watchful gaze, accompanied by the nurse. Grandfather, you shouldn't be here, but the nurse told me about your request. What do you need? He asked, his voice firm but without arrogance. I need to see the security footage. I have to know who went into my granddaughter's room before they died, George replied, his voice unwavering. The head of security studied him closely. He had met many grieving relatives, but there was something different about this man, no pleading, just resolve. All right. Follow me, the head of security said, turning. The walk to the room with the monitors felt slow, the tension in the air almost tangible. George could feel each step dragging time out, his heart pounding louder with every beat. When they entered the room, the head of security sat down at the console filled with screens and began to rewind the footage. What time did your granddaughters arrive at the hospital? He asked, manipulating the controls. They were admitted yesterday for an examination, George replied, never taking his eyes off the screen. The images on the monitors began to rewind, stopping at the crucial moment. The cameras showed the hallway outside the room where Olivia and Amelia had been. And then, there she was on the screen, Patricia. She carried a large handbag, glanced around to make sure no one was in sight, and entered the girl's room. There she is. There she is. Ah, she went into my granddaughter's room, George exclaimed, pointing at the screen. The head of security frowned and leaned closer to the monitor. They watched as Patricia emerged from the room a few minutes later, her face expressionless. This looks suspicious, the head of security said, his eyes fixed on the screen. I'll contact the police immediately. She poisoned them. I knew it. I've always known, George shouted, feeling the fury rise in his chest. I won't let her get away with this. His voice echoed through the cold morgue walls as images from the past flashed before his eyes, bright and painful. Patricia. She was the source of all his misfortunes. Not just the loss of his granddaughters, but everything else he had lost. When his son, Andrew, married Patricia, George immediately felt something was off. She was beautiful, intelligent, and seemed to genuinely love Andrew. But behind that perfect facade was a calculating woman for whom love was merely a tool to achieve her goals. George saw it, but Andrew was blind to it. She pretended to care for him. She was just waiting for the right moment to take everything for herself, George murmured, his hands trembling with anger. After Andrew's death, Patricia had taken on the role of the family's sole support. She had been a caring stepmother to the girls, but George knew that beneath it all was a cold hatred. Patricia had never wanted children, and the girls reminded her of the fact that she could never truly be their mother. Moreover, after the tragic death of Andrew, the girls had become the heirs to his fortune. Everything, the house, the business, even the savings, was left to them, while Patricia remained only a guardian with no real power. George had often noticed the way her face twisted with anger when she thought no one was watching. She tolerated the girls for show, waiting for the right moment, George muttered bitterly. All this time, she was plotting. She wanted them out of the way to claim the inheritance. Patricia started small, stripping the girls of their usual comforts, taking away their toys, making them feel unwanted. But when she realized this wouldn't get her what she wanted, she took things further. I knew she was capable of this, George muttered to himself. But he hadn't expected her to go this far. He recalled how Patricia had openly stated several times that she had no intention of sharing the wealth with children who weren't hers. She had assured George that everything she did was for the good of the family. But now, standing over his granddaughters' beds, he understood that her idea of family had always been about her own personal gain. Rage flooded through him. She got rid of Andrew, he growled through clenched teeth. His death had not been an accident. And now she was going after the girls. He thought back to that night when Andrew had died in the car crash. Patricia had been the only passenger, and she had walked away with only minor injuries. That's when George had first felt something wasn't right, but he couldn't prove anything. Afterward, Patricia had quickly moved to establish guardianship over Daria and Amelia. She gets rid of anyone who stands in her way, he said, feeling his mind race. But I won't let her hurt them. Now everything was falling into place. Patricia wanted the girls dead so she could be the sole heir. She thought she had everything under control, but George was determined to ruin her plans. His breathing quickened, but he forced himself to calm down. Emotion was clouding his judgment. He had a goal, and he couldn't let anger cloud his mind. You thought I would back down, Patricia? George whispered. But I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you get what you deserve. He glanced at his granddaughters. Their faces looked so peaceful, but George knew they were still fighting for their lives. And now, he was fighting for them. The head of security grabbed his phone and started dialing. George closed his eyes, forcing himself to take deeper breaths, despite the weakness in his legs. But he wasn't going to fall. Not now, when his granddaughters needed justice. From across the room, a nurse watched the scene unfold, sympathy in her eyes. She had seen her fair share of tragedy in this hospital, but she could tell this case would be far more complicated. The camera screen continued to replay footage of Patricia coming in and out of the girls' room. The evidence was clear. The truth was starting to surface. When he returned home, the silence in the house was deafening. George sat at the worn kitchen table, a torn piece of paper with a phone number scribbled on it in front of him. This was his last connection to someone who could help him, a person who knew more about poisons and their antidotes than anyone else. I hope you're still willing to help me, George mumbled, as the relentless ticking of the clock echoed through the stillness of the night. He had no choice. He grabbed the phone, his trembling hands gripping it tightly, and dialed the number. Each click of the keys seemed like the ringing of a bell, shattering the silence. On the fourth ring, the phone was picked up. Who's this? A raspy, tired voice asked. It's me, George. I need your help, Peter, he said, his voice tense. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. There was a rustling sound, as though someone had abruptly pushed away from a chair. Didn't expect to hear your voice again, old man, Peter replied, his tone a mix of surprise and weariness. I thought you'd forgotten about people like me. Now's not the time for reproaches, Peter. I'm in trouble. My granddaughters, they've been poisoned. The silence on the other end of the line grew heavy, laden with meaning. Peter, though he had lost his reputation due to past mistakes, had never lost the ability to recognize danger. Are they dead? He asked, his tone turning more serious. Officially, yes. But I believe they're still alive. I saw it in their eyes. I need your knowledge, Peter. Is there any way to save them? George's voice cracked, but it held a firm resolve. What you're asking me to do isn't easy, George, Peter sighed. Not all poisons have an antidote. It all depends on what was used. But if it's the woman I think it is, I may have something. What I'm about to tell you is dangerous, George. I have a strong antidote. You won't find it in any pharmacy or hospital. It was used in experiments and its effectiveness isn't guaranteed. In some cases, it works. In others, it could kill them. If you make a mistake, it'll be the end for them. Give me a chance. These girls deserve to live, George's voice cracked. Not from weakness, but from the determination of a man willing to do anything. Peter paused for a moment. You'll have to come get it yourself. I can't send it, and I can't bring it myself. Move fast, you don't have much time. Peter's voice became harsher. George quickly gathered his things, his mind focused on one thing, saving his granddaughters or dying trying. He jumped into his car and sped down the dark streets. The city felt different now, as if every window was watching him, and the shadows of the buildings seemed to move with his thoughts. The streetlights flickered in the distance, and the engine noise felt louder than usual. When he arrived at the old boarding house where Peter lived, the place looked run down, with peeling walls and grimy windows. George wasted no time. He banged on the door so hard that the sound echoed through the building. Peter, it's me, George shouted as the door creaked open. On the threshold stood Peter. His face was tired, with deep circles under his eyes, his hair a tangled mess, and his posture slouched. He was no longer the man George remembered from his youth, but his eyes still had that sharp, calculating look. Come in, Peter said, glancing around the street before shutting the door. Inside, the air smelled damp and musty. On the table, there were jars and bottles with homemade labels. Dim light bulbs cast long, uneasy shadows on the walls. Here's the antidote, Peter said, picking up a small glass vial filled with a blue liquid. You have to administer it directly to the heart. If they're unconscious, this is your only chance. No mistakes. I understand. How much do I owe you? George asked, carefully taking the vial. Peter gave a bitter smile. I don't need anything, old man. I just want this to work. If the girls survive, it'll all have been worth it. They shook hands firmly. Their silence spoke louder than words. George tucked the vial away and stepped into the night, wasting no time. He raced back to the hospital, focusing on the road, his mind entirely fixed on making it in time. If he was late, or if the antidote didn't work, he would lose everything. By the time George reached the hospital, it was well past midnight. The building loomed ominously under the harsh light of the floodlamps. He moved silently, like a man used to staying in the shadows. Every step was deliberate and calculated. Once, George had served in special forces. As he often said, those skills never faded. His training and years of experience helped him stay unseen. Memories of his past life flashed through his mind as he bypassed the security. In the special forces, he had learned how to be a shadow, an unseen threat. Now, these skills that had seemed forgotten in his peaceful life had become his weapon once again. George used the side entrance, which was unguarded. He surveyed the area, carefully checking every corner before proceeding. In the hallway, there was a lone guard, absorbed in his phone. George pressed himself against the wall, blending into the shadows. He watched as the guard turned to check the door behind him. This moment was crucial. George moved with the silence of a ghost. He slipped by without making a sound, and the guard didn't even notice his presence. Skills stay with you forever, George thought. Even after all these years, his heart beat steady, his breathing calm, just like in the days of training. Every step brought him closer to his granddaughter's room, and he was ready to use everything he knew to save them. Finally, he reached the room where his granddaughters lay. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of the medical machines. The white light reflected off their pale faces. George went to Olivia first. He pulled the vial from his pocket, filled the syringe with the blue liquid, and knelt beside her bed. I can't make a mistake. Not now, he whispered to himself. His heart pounded so loudly he could feel it in his ears. His hand trembled slightly, but he took a deep breath to steady himself. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, he injected the liquid directly into her heart. The blue fluid slowly entered her body. Several seconds passed. Nothing happened. The silence was unbearable. George froze, staring at his granddaughter's face, waiting for any sign. Suddenly, her chest rose sharply. She inhaled deeply, her eyes flew open, and a faint sound escaped her throat. The world around George seemed to spin. Olivia. Olivia, it's me, Grandpa. I'm here. His voice cracked with emotion. Olivia blinked several times, her gaze blurry, but there was life in her eyes again. Grandpa, she whispered weakly. You're safe, my girl. It's all okay, George whispered, tears running down his cheeks. But there was no time for joy. He turned to Amelia, hope filling him. He had one dose of the antidote left. Hang in there, Amelia. Don't leave me, he whispered, repeating the procedure. He injected the antidote once more, his hand steady despite the fatigue. Time seemed to freeze as beads of sweat trickled down his face. Finally, her chest rose, and soon after, a faint breath followed. Grandpa, Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible. George fell to his knees between the two beds, tears streaming down his face. I've brought you back. I've brought back my life, he murmured, gazing at them with gratitude. The heart monitors, which had been silent moments before, now filled the room with a rhythmic beat. George knelt between the two beds, his face wet with tears, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his eyes shone with hope. Olivia turned her head toward him, her lips moving slowly, as if each word was a monumental effort. Grandpa. Her voice was a whisper. What? What happened? George gripped her hand tightly, gently stroking it to comfort her. Don't worry, my girl. He replied, trying to mask his own anxiety. It's going to be okay. I'm here. Everything will be fine. Amelia struggled to open her eyes. She blinked, as if trying to make sense of what was happening. Her gaze was confused, as though the world around her was unfamiliar. Where are we? She croaked, her voice hoarse. You're in the hospital, my girls, George said softly, his hand brushing her forehead. I brought you back, and now I won't let anyone hurt you. He wiped his tears with the sleeve of his coat, but his heart still felt uneasy. He knew they didn't have much time. At any moment, someone could walk into the room and discover the girls were awake. Listen to me carefully, George spoke in a firm voice, looking at his granddaughters as if giving them the most important advice of their lives. Don't tell anyone what happened. Trust no one but me. They can't know that you've woken up. Understand? Olivia and Amelia exchanged a look. Their weary eyes quickly shifted to a realization of the seriousness in George's words. Both girls nodded slowly. If someone comes in, keep your eyes closed, no matter what you hear. Don't open your eyes, he insisted. I'll protect you. The sound of footsteps outside the door made him freeze. Voices echoed in the hallway. One was firm and commanding, the other more nervous. Why is this room's door open? A male voice asked. I don't know, sir. Maybe it wasn't shut properly, answered the second voice, trembling with anxiety. The footsteps grew closer. George hid in the corner of the room, blending into the shadows. His breathing slowed and became controlled, like a hunter waiting for his prey. He kept his eyes locked on the door, prepared for any turn of events. The door creaked open with a long, drawn-out sound. Two figures entered. A security guard and a doctor dressed in a white lab coat. The guard scanned the room, while the doctor moved toward the bed. This is odd, the doctor remarked, eyeing the monitors. The electrical activity has increased. Weren't they supposed to be dead? The guard asked, his face clearly puzzled. That's what I was told, the doctor replied, moving closer to Olivia's bed. He examined her face and gently lifted her eyelids. The color had returned to her skin. The pallor is gone. This is impossible. She's alive. The guard stepped back, as though he had seen a ghost. Doctor, should I report this to administration? He asked, still in shock. Not yet. I need to figure out what's going on here. I don't want to be accused of negligence, the doctor said, frowning. Bring in the resuscitation equipment. I need to check something, the doctor ordered. The guard nodded and hurried out of the room. George knew time was running out. If the doctor started running tests, he'd soon realize the girls were awake, and everything would fall apart. The doctor pulled out his stethoscope and pressed it to Amelia's chest. George felt his body tense, every muscle pulled tight like a bowstring ready to snap. This is strange, the doctor whispered. Her heart is beating slowly, but steadily. He then pulled out a small flashlight and leaned closer to Amelia's face to check her pupils. George knew this was the moment that would decide everything. He quietly stepped out of the shadows, his footsteps silent. His gaze was sharp, movements precise. As the doctor leaned in closer to Amelia, George made his move. With one hand, he clamped his palm over the doctor's mouth, while his other hand grabbed him by the throat. The flashlight slipped from the doctor's hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. "Listen carefully, doctor," George whispered, his eyes filled with cold determination. "I will kill you if you don't do exactly as I say. You didn't see anything, you didn't hear anything. You'll walk out of here, and forget everything that happened." "Understood," the doctor stammered, his eyes wide with terror. George slowly released his grip, keeping a close eye on the doctor's every move. "If you say a word to anyone, I'll find you." "I've got nothing left to lose." George's voice was as cold as ice. The doctor quickly rushed out of the room. Without looking back, the door shut behind him. George turned to his granddaughters, took their hands, and whispered softly, "It's okay, my girls. Everything's going to be fine. I won't let anyone hurt you." His voice cracked, not from fear, but from determination. He knew that he had just crossed a line of no return. But in that moment, his only focus was on his granddaughters. He had to protect them, no matter the cost. The room fell back into silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. George stood next to their beds, his gaze shifting between the two girls and the door. It was as if he was expecting someone to burst in at any moment. His heart raced, but his mind remained calm and focused. Olivia moved her hand slightly, her fingers twitching ever so faintly. George immediately leaned closer, gently taking her hand in his. "Olivia, are you okay?" he whispered. She gave a weak nod, her lips barely parting. "Grandpa, are we safe?" Her voice was faint but filled with worry. "For now, yes," George replied, trying to steady his voice. "But we need to leave. It's not safe here." From the far side of the room, there was a faint sound. Amelia stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and she tried to speak. "Grandpa, what's happening?" Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. George walked over to her, gently stroking her hair. "It's okay, my dear. We're leaving soon," he said, his tone firm, though his eyes betrayed the tension inside. He knew they couldn't stay much longer. The doctor could come back with security, and if that happened, they wouldn't stand a chance. George walked to the window and carefully opened it. Outside, the second floor wasn't too high, but the fall could still be dangerous. He returned to the girls. "Listen to me. We're going out through the window. I'll help you, but you need to be very careful. Olivia, we'll start with you. Can you do it?" Olivia struggled to sit up, using her hands for support. George helped her to her feet, supporting her fragile body. "Hold on to me," he said softly, guiding her gently. He opened the window all the way, letting the cool night air in. Olivia shivered, but George held her tight. "Don't be afraid. I'm here to help you. Slowly, keep your hand on the wall," he instructed. Olivia took a deep breath, her face tense, but she nodded. George carefully helped her out the window, her legs dangling in the air. He held her firmly until she could press herself against the wall. "Come on, just a little more. I've got you," he encouraged her. With every step she took downward, Olivia grew more confident, her movements becoming steadier. At last, her feet touched the ground. "I did it, Grandpa," she said, her voice full of weak relief. "Good job, my girl. Now, hide behind those bushes and wait for me. Don't come out, no matter what," George instructed. Olivia nodded and slowly made her way to the nearest bushes. Her steps were clumsy but resolute. George turned back to Amelia. She was weaker, her eyes closing from exhaustion. But when she saw the determination in her grandfather's eyes, she found the strength to rise. "Now it's your turn, Amelia. You can do it," he said, lifting her into his arms. Her body was heavy, and every step was a struggle for George, but he didn't allow himself to show any weakness. He carefully helped her through the window. "Go slow. I'll hold you," he whispered, keeping a close eye on every move she made. Her feet slipped, and George barely managed to catch her. "Don't let go, Amelia. Everything will be all right." His voice was steady. At last, her feet reached the ground, and nothing remained to hold on to. He climbed out onto the windowsill, his heart pounding like a drum. He jumped, his feet slamming against the ground. Pain shot through his knees, but he didn't stop. "Run, girls," he shouted. Olivia and Amelia, leaning on each other for support, sprinted ahead, disappearing into the shadow of the bushes. George followed, feeling the cold night air whip against his face. Voices echoed through the hospital corridors. Check every room. They couldn't have gotten far. George realized they were running out of time. He had to get the girls farther away. This way. Follow me, he commanded, leading them toward the woods, where thick underbrush could hide them from pursuers. The three figures disappeared into the night, leaving behind the cold light of the hospital windows. The biting night wind cut at George's face, but he didn't stop. Ahead, hidden among the trees and bushes, Olivia and Amelia were doing their best to keep up, though their strength was almost gone. George occasionally glanced back, listening to the sounds of the chase. The noise of voices and barking dogs was getting louder. Don't stop, girls, he urged, pushing them forward. We're almost safe. Gasping for breath, Olivia turned to her grandfather. Grandpa, they're catching up, she whispered, her eyes filled with fear. George stopped, crouched in front of her and placed his hands on her. Look at me, Olivia. We'll make it out. As long as I'm here with you, no one will hurt you. You have to trust me. Amelia, hugging herself, was shaking from the cold. But what if they find us? Her voice trembled, matching the shivers in her body. George looked at both girls with firm eyes. They won't find you. I won't let that happen. We'll fight until the end, but you have to listen to me and do exactly what I say. He hugged them both, briefly but tightly, sharing his determination with them. Now, let's go. And don't stop. They continued through the forest. Branches snagged their clothes, and the tall grass whispered against Olivia's legs. George paused, calculating how much time they had left. This way, he said, pointing toward the dense thicket. The further we go, the harder it will be for them to track us. They veered off the beaten path and into the thick underbrush. Every movement was becoming more difficult. The branches scratched at their skin, and tree roots made them stumble. Olivia and Amelia struggled to keep their balance but kept going, their eyes fixed on their grandfather, who led them forward. After a few minutes, they reached a small clearing where, hidden among the trees, an old wooden shed could be seen. Its walls were covered in moss, and the roof had partially collapsed, but to them, it looked like a fortress. Faster, over here, George commanded, opening the shed door. Get inside and stay quiet. Olivia and Amelia slipped inside. George followed and shut the door behind them. He turned to Amelia, her voice shaky. How long do we need to stay here? Until it's safe, George replied, his eyes never leaving the door. No one will find us here. Outside, the barking of dogs grew louder. A gruff male voice was issuing commands. Check everywhere, they must be close. George tensed. He closed his eyes, praying silently that they wouldn't be discovered. He could hear the branches snapping under heavy footsteps. The barking was getting closer. He glanced at the girls. They were huddled together, their eyes filled with fear. George removed his coat and draped it over them. Hang on, my girls. We'll make it, he whispered. The footsteps were now right outside the shed. One of the dogs started barking and growling loudly, right next to their hiding spot. There's something here, one of the men shouted. George tensed, his fists clenched. Is it just an animal, or something like that? Said another voice. There's all sorts of wildlife around here. I'm not sure, let's check, came the response. George froze. The flashlight beam slipped through a crack in the shed's walls. A flicker of light passed over Amelia's face, but George quickly shielded her with his own body. Nothing here. Let's move on, said the first voice. The footsteps began to fade, and soon the silence returned. George exhaled deeply, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. Olivia lifted her head and whispered. They're gone. For now, George answered, sitting down next to his granddaughters. But we need to be ready. This isn't over. He hugged them close, pulling them in tightly. In the dim light of the moon filtering through the cracks in the shed walls, he saw their tired faces and knew that there were more challenges ahead. The night seemed endless. Inside the damp, dusty shed, George sat on the floor with his granddaughters in his arms. Olivia and Amelia were quietly dozing, their heads resting on his chest. George couldn't let himself relax. His eyes stayed focused on the crack in the door, watching for any sign of danger. When the first rays of dawn began to filter through the tree branches, he felt the tension of the night begin to lift. But he knew they couldn't stay here much longer. Amelia was the first to stir. She opened her eyes and looked up at her grandfather. Grandpa, are we still in the woods? Her voice was weak, but there was hope in it. Yes, sweetheart. But we need to keep moving. It's not safe here, George said gently, stroking her head. He carefully woke Olivia, who rubbed her eyes and looked around. Are we safe? She asked. For now, George replied briefly, helping her to her feet. But we need to keep going. He wrapped his granddaughters in his coat to shield them from the morning chill and led them toward a nearby refuge, a small cabin atop a hill. He recalled the days of his hunting trips with his son, a secluded place where they might not be found. The journey was tough. Olivia and Amelia, weakened by the recent events, struggled to keep their footing. George encouraged them as best he could, offering support when they stumbled. We're almost there, girls. Just a little more, he said as they began to tire. Finally, between the trees, the old cabin appeared. The cabin looked abandoned. George pressed his shoulder against the wall, and the old door creaked open after a firm push. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the smell of dust and dampness. In the corners, there were old chairs scattered about, and in the center stood a crooked wooden table. In the far corner, a fireplace held the remnants of old coals. Sit down, rest, George said, helping his granddaughters settle against the wall. He quickly began gathering dry branches from the corner of the cabin to start a fire. As the first flames flickered in the hearth, the girls moved closer, feeling the warmth slowly return life to their cold bodies. Amelia looked at her grandfather. What are we going to do next? She asked, her voice soft. George glanced at his granddaughters and then at the fire. His face remained grim. We're going to fight, he said firmly. I will give back everything that was taken from you. Your safety, your home, your life. But first, we need to regain our strength. Olivia and Amelia nodded, their eyes slowly closing. They huddled together, comforted by the fire and the presence of their grandfather. George remained seated beside them, keeping a watchful eye on the door. His mind was heavy with thoughts of what had happened. Patricia? Her cold smile, her contempt. He knew that as long as she was free, his granddaughters would never be safe. But he had made a promise to himself. He would protect them at any cost. He was ready to do whatever it took. As the girls drifted to sleep, George stayed awake. He knew that in this world, justice wasn't something that came to those who waited, but to those who acted. The cold morning wind crept through the gaps in the cabin walls, but the fire in the hearth kept them warm. Sitting by the door, George peered through the crack to watch for any signs of movement. His thoughts kept circling back to Patricia, the woman who had taken everything from him. She thought she could get away with it, he thought, gripping his jaw tightly. But he was certain he'd find a way to put an end to her influence once and for all. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps. Someone was approaching. George immediately sprang to action, grabbing a broken piece of an old chair he had left nearby in case of danger. The footsteps were slow and confident, as though the person wasn't trying to hide. He leaned toward the door, carefully peering through the gap. On the doorstep stood a man in a worn-out jacket. George recognized him. It was Daniel, one of his son's former employees. George, I know you're in there, came a deep voice. I'm not here to fight. I need to talk. George gritted his teeth but remained silent. He couldn't trust Daniel, especially knowing that he had once worked with Patricia. Please, let me explain, Daniel continued. I've come to offer you help. George stayed quiet, his gaze as cold as ever, his fingers tightly gripping the broken chair leg. Patricia thinks she's untouchable, but her time is running out. Daniel took a step closer. The police already know your granddaughters were poisoned. Someone didn't do a good enough job of keeping them safe. Why are you here? George asked sternly. What do you want? Daniel gave a slight smile, but there was no joy in his eyes. I don't want anything from you, he said. I'm tired of being her puppet. She used me first. Why should I believe you? George demanded, his eyes locked on Daniel's. Because I have what you need, Daniel replied. I know where she is. She's hiding out in her sister's old house in the woods. There are only a couple of guards with her. This is your chance. George squinted, feeling a spark of hope ignite inside him. If you're lying, he started. I'm not, Daniel interrupted. I want her gone, but I can't do it without your help. George watched Daniel silently, evaluating his intentions. His mind was fixated on one thing. If there was even the slightest chance to take down Patricia, he had to take it. All right, George said, stepping back. Come in. Daniel entered, his eyes scanning the cabin. In the corner, he noticed Olivia and Amelia still asleep, wrapped up in their grandfather's coat. The smile on his face faded. These are them? he asked, his tone now serious. Daniel sat at the table, his expression grave. She's at her sister's place. It's an old house in the woods, about 10 miles from here. I can take you there, but you'll have to be careful. She's expecting someone might come. George glanced at the girls. His eyes softened for a moment, but his resolve remained unshaken. I'll do it, he said coldly. But if anything happens to them, you'll regret ever being born. Daniel raised his hands in a gesture of peace. They'll be safe. I'm on your side, he reassured. George stood up, walked over to his granddaughters, and gently tucked the blanket tighter around them. I'll be back, my girls. I promise, he whispered, then turned to Daniel. Lead the way. Daniel nodded and headed for the door. George took one last look at his granddaughters before following. Their faces looked so vulnerable while they slept. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and stepped out of the cabin, following his guide. The sky was beginning to lighten, but the forest remained dark, swallowed by the shadows of the trees. Daniel walked confidently, glancing back now and then to ensure George was keeping up. We'll be there in a couple of hours if we keep moving quickly, Daniel said quietly. George didn't reply, his gaze focused ahead. He was only thinking about what lay ahead when Daniel paused for a moment and turned around. We need to be quiet. Patricia may have watchers around the house, he warned. George nodded and moved forward, careful not to make a sound. Soon, they reached a clearing where the house came into view in the distance. It was an old cabin, guarded by a few men, but they were armed. If we get too close, they might notice us. George squinted, surveying the area. 2 men were standing at the entrance, lazily chatting. One was smoking, the other was checking his phone. Both looked relaxed, but George knew better than to trust appearances. You stay here, he said, turning to Daniel. This is my fight. Daniel frowned but didn't argue. Fine, but be careful. If something goes wrong, I've got your back. George nodded and began to move toward the house, using the trees and bushes for cover. His movements were swift and silent, like a seasoned hunter. When he got close enough, he spotted a large rock underfoot. Picking it up, he slowly approached one of the guards. With sudden precision, George struck him in the head. The man dropped silently. The second guard noticed, but George hissed, "Don't scream. Tell me who's inside," he demanded. The guard, terrified, stammered, "Just her. I don't know anything else." "Then get out. Run and don't come back," George ordered, releasing him. The man didn't hesitate and fled toward the woods. George quietly opened the door to the house. He knew Patricia was somewhere inside. "You found me, old man?" Her voice echoed from the depths of the room. George turned around to see her standing there. Patricia was leaning against the wall, her face unreadable, but there was rage in her eyes. "Didn't think you'd find me so fast," she smirked, raising a glass. "Well, what's it gonna be? Want to end this right here?" "Yes," George replied firmly. "This is the end." Patricia laughed, her cold, mocking laughter filling the room. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I'm stronger than you. I always have been, and I always will be." But George didn't listen anymore. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room for any potential traps. Patricia watched him, her face betraying no fear. "You don't get it," she continued. "I always win. This world belongs to the strong, and you? You're just an old man trying to fight fate." George stopped right in front of her. His voice was quiet but firm. "You won't hurt my family anymore." She looked at him with disdain. "What will you do? Kill me? Right here, in front of your conscience?" she asked with a mocking smile. George didn't answer, but his eyes burned with fury. At that moment, the sound of sirens could be heard from outside. Patricia paled. "The police?" she hissed, her confidence beginning to falter. "You called them?" George nodded. "I have proof. The footage from the hospital cameras. Everyone knows it was you." Her face twisted with anger. She took a step back, her hands clenching into fists. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'll come for you and your little girls. Do you hear me? I'll be back." George shouted at her, trying to break free. But before she could escape, she was quickly subdued and taken away. George watched silently, a sense of relief washing over him, mixed with exhaustion. When the house was empty, he stepped outside and looked up at the sky. The rain was starting to fall, but he stood still, letting the droplets run down his face. It was over. He turned and made his way back to the forest, to his little girls waiting for him. He knew their lives would never be the same, but now, they were safe. It was his victory. George trudged through the woods, feeling the rain intensify. His body was worn out, his legs weak from moving between the trees, his heart pounding faster. He quickened his pace despite the exhaustion. Inside, Olivia and Amelia were waiting, wrapped in his coat, huddled together. Hearing his footsteps, they looked up. Their eyes immediately filled with joy. "Grandpa!" Olivia shouted, running to him. George dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms tightly around both of his granddaughters. They clung to him, their tears mixing with the rain on his face. "It's over, my girls," he said softly but firmly. "She's gone. She won't hurt you anymore." Amelia lifted her head, her face filled with relief. "So, we're safe now?" she whispered. George nodded, pulling her closer. "Yes, everything will be okay now." He gently led the girls back to the fireplace, where the fire crackled, filling the cabin with warmth. They sat together, surrounded by the crackling of the fire and the quiet stillness of the forest. Olivia carefully placed her hand on her grandfather's hand. "Thank you, Grandpa. You saved us?" George smiled, his eyes moistening, but he held back the tears. "I just did what I had to do," he replied. "You are my family. I would never leave you." Olivia and Amelia hugged him again, their small arms wrapped around his neck. "We love you, Grandpa," they whispered in unison. George didn't say anything, just hugged them tighter. This was the moment he had fought for. Not for money, not for fame, but for this instant when he knew his granddaughters were finally safe. Days passed. George, along with his granddaughters, returned to their home, which now felt different, warm and full of life. Neighbors came by to visit, bringing food and asking questions, but George's responses were distant and brief. He knew that there was a long road ahead to rebuild what Patricia had destroyed. The police confirmed her arrest, and now a trial awaited her. The evidence against her was undeniable, and there was no way for her to escape the consequences. Her power had been shattered, and the fear she once instilled vanished along with her freedom. One evening, when Olivia and Amelia had already fallen asleep, George sat by the window, gazing at the starry sky. He thought of his son, who once lived in this house, laughed, and was happy. "We made it," he whispered into the emptiness, speaking to the memory of his son. "Your girls are safe now." His gaze grew firm, yet there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. He knew the future wouldn't be easy, but the important thing was that his family was together again. Now George could rest. He closed his eyes for the first time in a long while, allowing himself to feel at peace. Thank you for listening to the story until the end. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, let me know what you think, and share this video with your friends and loved ones. It motivates us to keep making videos. You can explore all of our stories in the catalog. See you soon.